I never thought I'd have to explain to another adult why breaking into a root cellar on private property was a bad idea. Yet that was exactly where I found myself on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, standing at my kitchen window, coffee in hand, watching HOA Karen trespass like she owned the place. The root cellar had been there longer than the HOA, longer than most of the houses, older than the rules she loved to wave around. And somehow, in her mind, that made it community property. The cellar sat partially underground at the edge of my land, built nearly a century ago by the original homesteaders. Stone walls, a heavy wooden door reinforced with iron bands, and a narrow dirt path leading to it. I used it for storage, preserves, tools, and family keepsakes. It was documented in the deed, surveyed, insured, and very clearly mine. But HOA Karen had never cared much for paperwork when it didn't benefit her. It started weeks earlier with complaints. She claimed the cellar was unsafe, unsightly, and a liability risk to the neighborhood. I reminded her politely that it was not visible from the road, not accessible to anyone but me, and absolutely not under HOA jurisdiction. She didn't like that answer. Karen never did. She preferred authority over accuracy. That afternoon, I noticed movement near the tree line. At first, I assumed it was a deer or one of the neighborhood kids cutting through the woods. Then I saw the clipboard. Then the familiar stiff walk. HOA Karen. Alone. Purposeful. Head down like she was on a mission. My stomach tightened immediately. She wasn't there to talk. I watched as she walked straight to the cellar, ignored the posted, private property, no trespassing sign, and tried the handle. Locked. She looked around, irritated, then pulled out her phone. A few minutes later, she crouched down near the old vent opening, shining her flashlight inside like she was inspecting a crime scene. I set my coffee down. Something was very wrong. Then she did it. She reached behind one of the stones near the doorframe and pulled out the spare key I used for emergencies. I felt my jaw drop. That key was hidden, not obvious, and definitely not for HOA use. My heart started pounding. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a deliberate break-in. She unlocked the door and stepped inside my root cellar without hesitation. No knocking. No notice. No permission. Just entitlement. I stood frozen for a moment, replaying what I'd just seen, hoping I was mistaken. I wasn't. The door swung shut behind her, and the darkness swallowed her completely. Anger hit first, then disbelief, then something colder and more focused. This wasn't about rules or disputes anymore. This was trespassing. This was breaking and entering. And for once, HOA Karen had crossed a line she couldn't argue her way out of. I grabbed my phone and quietly walked out the back door, staying out of sight. As I approached the cellar, I could hear her inside, muttering to herself, shifting boxes, taking photos. She was documenting my property like she owned it, like she had every right to be there. Standing there, hand on the heavy wooden door, I realized something important. I had options. And this time, I wasn't going to warn her. I wasn't going to debate. I wasn't going to play polite homeowner. I was going to let her actions speak for themselves. I closed the door slowly, firmly, and felt the latch click into place. Then I took out my phone and dialed the police. The moment the latch clicked, everything changed. The cellar went silent for half a second, then erupted. I heard footsteps rush toward the door, followed by a sharp rattle of the handle. HOA Karen yanked on it once, then again. Harder this time. The wood groaned, but held. I didn't move. I stood there, phone already in my hand, heart pounding but mind clear. "Hello," she called out, her voice suddenly tight. "This door is stuck." Stuck. Not locked. Not closed. Stuck. Even now, she couldn't bring herself to admit she wasn't supposed to be inside. I stepped back a few feet, making sure I was visible but not close enough for her to see me clearly through the small vent opening. "Step away from the door," I said calmly. There was a pause. Then anger. "You can't lock me in here," she snapped. "I'm conducting an HOA safety inspection." I almost laughed. Almost. Instead, I pressed the phone to my ear as the dispatcher answered. I gave my address first, then explained slowly and clearly that someone had entered my locked root cellar without permission and was now refusing to leave. I avoided names. I stuck to facts. Trespass. Unauthorized entry. Ongoing incident. Behind me, Karen's voice grew louder. "This is illegal," she yelled. "You are obstructing an HOA official." I held the phone out so the dispatcher could hear. The shouting echoed inside the stone chamber, raw and unfiltered. The dispatcher asked if I felt threatened. I said no, but I did feel concern for property damage and safety. That mattered. Words mattered. I had learned that the hard way. A few minutes passed, though it felt longer. Karen alternated between pounding on the door and shouting threats about fines, lawsuits, and consequences. She promised emergency meetings. She promised attorneys. She promised my life would become very difficult. I listened without responding. Every word she said was being documented now. At one point, her tone shifted. "Let me out, and we can resolve this," she said, suddenly softer. "There's no need to involve the police." That right there was the moment I knew I'd done the right thing. If she truly believed she had authority, she wouldn't be asking. She would be demanding. The request meant she understood the risk she'd taken. I told the dispatcher exactly that. "She's now asking to leave," I said. "She entered without permission and is acknowledging she shouldn't be here." The dispatcher assured me officers were on the way. I stayed where I was, keeping the door closed but not adding any additional locks. I wasn't trapping her. I was securing my property until authorities arrived. There was a difference, and I needed that difference to be crystal clear. From inside the cellar, Karen's anger returned, sharper this time, edged with panic. She accused me of harassment. She accused me of kidnapping. She accused me of abuse of power, which would have been funny if it weren't so serious. I said nothing. Silence was safer than argument. I could hear her pacing now, the scrape of shoes on dirt, the clink of jars being brushed aside. She was nervous. The reality was setting in. This wasn't a meeting. This wasn't a warning letter. This was a police call with her on the wrong side of a locked door. In the distance, I heard sirens. Karen heard them too. The pounding stopped. Her voice dropped. "You don't understand," she said quietly. "This is going to be a problem." I looked at the door, then at my phone, then back at the cellar entrance. For the first time since this started, I felt something close to relief. "No," I said, finally speaking again. Breaking into my property was the problem. And I waited for the police to arrive. The sirens grew louder, cutting through the quiet afternoon like a blade. Karen heard them clearly now. I could tell by the way her breathing changed, the way her footsteps stopped pacing and settled near the door. For the first time since I'd known her, HOA Karen wasn't talking. She was listening, and that silence said more than all her earlier threats combined. 2 patrol cars pulled up at the edge of my driveway, gravel crunching beneath their tires. I raised my hands as the officers stepped out, not because I was afraid, but because I wanted everything about this encounter to be unmistakably calm and cooperative. I introduced myself, explained the situation, and handed over my phone with the open call still connected. The dispatcher confirmed the details for them. One officer approached the cellar door cautiously, while the other stayed with me. He knocked once, firmly. "Ma'am," he called, "identify yourself." "I'm an HOA board member," Karen shouted from inside. "I'm being held here against my will." The officer glanced back at me, eyebrow raised, then returned his attention to the door. "Why are you inside this structure?" "I was conducting an inspection," she replied. "This homeowner refused access." That was my cue. I handed the second officer a folder I'd prepared weeks earlier, never imagining it would be used like this. Inside were the property deed, survey maps, photographs of the cellar, and a printed copy of the HOA bylaws clearly outlining jurisdiction limits. He flipped through them carefully, nodding as he read. "She doesn't have authority over this structure," he said to his partner. The officer at the door tried the handle. "Locked." "Sir," he asked me, "did you lock her inside?" "I secure my property after observing unauthorized entry," I replied. "I did not restrain her physically, and I called you immediately. The distinction mattered. Both officers knew it. They'd seen enough situations escalate because someone panicked or acted emotionally. This wasn't one of those cases. The door was opened, and Karen stepped out into the daylight, hair disheveled, clipboard clutched tightly like a life raft. She immediately began talking, words tumbling over each other as she tried to regain control of the narrative. She accused me of harassment, intimidation, unlawful detention. She insisted the HOA had implied authority. She said she feared for her safety. The officers listened patiently. Then one asked a simple question. Did you have permission to enter the structure? Karen hesitated. Just for a moment. But that moment was everything. I didn't need permission, she said finally. It's a community concern. The officer nodded slowly. That's not how private property works. Her face drained of color. They asked if she had used a key. She said yes. They asked where she got it. She said it was accessible. That answer didn't help her. I showed them the photos of where the spare key had been hidden and explained it was for emergency use only. The word emergency echoed in the air between us. The officers stepped aside with Karen for a private conversation. I stayed where I was, hands visible, breathing steady. I could hear fragments of their discussion. Trespassing. Unauthorized access. Potential charges. Each word landed heavier than the last. When they returned, the tone had shifted completely. Karen was no longer the enforcer. She was the problem. The officer informed her she was being formally trespassed from my property and warned that any future entry without permission would result in immediate charges. They documented the incident, took statements, and photographed the cellar door. Karen tried one last time. This isn't over, she said, voice trembling but defiant. The officer looked at her evenly. For today it is. As they left, one of them turned to me. You did the right thing, he said quietly. Most people don't stay this calm. I watched Karen walk back toward the street, smaller somehow, her authority stripped away by facts and consequences. The cellar stood behind me, solid and unchanged, just as it had been for 100 years. And for the first time since the HOA trouble began, I knew the balance of power had shifted for good. The police cars disappeared down the road, but the tension didn't leave with them. If anything, it settled deeper, heavier, like a storm that hadn't decided whether it was done. I stood there for a long moment, looking at the cellar door, replaying everything that had just happened. The silence felt unfamiliar after so much noise, threats, and adrenaline. By that evening, the emails started. The first was from the HOA board, labeled urgent. It claimed there had been a miscommunication regarding the incident and suggested an immediate meeting to clarify expectations. The language was careful, almost polite, but I could feel the irritation behind every sentence. Karen had talked, and she hadn't gone quietly. The next email arrived an hour later. This one warned about potential safety concerns related to the root cellar and requested documentation proving it met community standards. Community standards. For a structure built decades before the HOA even existed. I didn't reply. I archived it, the same way I archived every message from them now. Everything went into the record. Over the following days, neighbors began reaching out. Some were curious. Some were cautious. A few were quietly supportive. One older couple down the road admitted Karen had tried something similar with their shed years earlier, backing off only when they pushed back with legal paperwork. Hearing that changed something for me. This wasn't random. This was a pattern. Karen herself stayed away, but her presence lingered. I'd catch glimpses of her car slowing as it passed my driveway. Once, I found fresh footprints near the tree line, close enough to notice but far enough to deny intent. I installed cameras after that. Not to provoke, to protect. The HOA scheduled a special meeting to address recent events. I attended remotely, microphone muted, camera off. Karen spoke first. She framed the incident as a misunderstanding, carefully avoiding the word trespassing. She talked about safety, liability, and community values. She never mentioned the spare key. She never mentioned the police report. When it was my turn, I spoke briefly. Calmly. I stated the facts. Unauthorized entry. Police involvement. Formal trespass warning. I reminded them that the cellar was outside HOA jurisdiction and that any further attempts to access my property would be handled the same way. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I let the silence do the work. The board ended the meeting quickly. After that, things shifted. Notices stopped appearing. Emails became cautious, vague, noncommittal. Karen no longer walked the neighborhood with her clipboard like she owned it. Authority, I realized, only works when people believe in it. Once that illusion cracks, it doesn't repair easily. Still, I didn't relax. I reinforced the cellar door, moved the spare key, and added signage that made boundaries unmistakable. Private property. No HOA access. Violators will be prosecuted. It wasn't aggressive. It was clear. One afternoon, I went down into the cellar alone. The air was cool and familiar, the stone walls unchanged by the drama above ground. Jars sat exactly where I'd left them. Tools hung where they always had. This place had survived wars, storms, and generations of ownership. It wasn't going to be intimidated by a clipboard and a title. Standing there, I felt something settle inside me. This had never really been about the cellar. It was about control. About someone believing rules gave them the right to cross boundaries. And about what happens when those boundaries are enforced calmly, legally, and without apology. The HOA hadn't backed off because they suddenly understood fairness. They backed off because they understood risk. And for the first time since buying the property, I felt truly secure, not because no one would ever try again, but because I knew exactly how to respond if they did. Weeks passed and nothing happened. No surprise inspections. No warning letters taped to my gate. No frantic HOA emails pretending to be friendly while searching for leverage. The quiet was intentional, and that told me everything I needed to know. Karen hadn't changed. The HOA hadn't grown a conscience. They had simply learned where the line was, and that crossing it carried consequences. One afternoon, a certified letter arrived. I expected posturing or legal language, but instead it was brief. The HOA acknowledged the police report, confirmed they had no jurisdictional authority over the root cellar, and stated they would not pursue further action regarding the structure. No apology. No admission of wrongdoing. Just retreat. For people like them, that was as close to accountability as it ever gets. I filed the letter away, with the rest of the documentation. The folder had grown thick over the months. Emails, notices, surveys, photos, police records. It wasn't something I enjoyed keeping, but it represented something important. Proof. Proof that calm preparation beats bluster every time. Proof that entitlement collapses under scrutiny. Karen avoided me completely after that. When we crossed paths at a distance, she looked away. The clipboard was gone. So was the swagger. Authority, once stripped, doesn't come back easily. Neighbors noticed too. Conversations shifted. People spoke more openly about past run-ins, about fines that never made sense, about rules that only seemed to apply to some. One incident had cracked the image she'd built for years. The root cellar became exactly what it was meant to be again. Quiet. Useful. Forgotten by anyone who didn't belong there. I spent an afternoon reorganizing shelves, checking jars, replacing a few aging boards. Down there, surrounded by stone and earth, the whole ordeal felt distant and small. That space had endured far worse than an HOA dispute. It would outlast this too. I added one final measure, not out of fear, but out of closure. A solid steel hasp and a clearly marked lock, visible from a distance. Not hidden. Not subtle. Anyone approaching would understand immediately. This was not open, not shared, not negotiable. Boundaries only work when they're unmistakable. Looking back, what struck me most wasn't Karen's behavior. People like her exist everywhere. What mattered was how easily situations like this escalate when no one pushes back properly. Yelling wouldn't have helped. Threats wouldn't have helped. Trying to out HOA, the HOA would have dragged me into their world. Facts, patience, and restraint did the work instead. There was a moment, standing at that cellar door with my hand on the latch, when I could have walked away. when I could have convinced myself it wasn't worth the trouble. That's what people like Karen rely on, the assumption that resistance is exhausting. But that day, I chose to hold the line. And everything changed because of it. The property felt different afterward. Not because the land had changed, but because my relationship to it had. I wasn't just living there anymore. I was actively protecting it. That sense of ownership, real ownership, is something no HOA rulebook can grant or revoke. Every so often, I catch sight of the cellar from my kitchen window, just like I did that first afternoon. Now it brings a sense of calm instead of tension. A reminder that boundaries matter, that preparation matters, and that when someone breaks into what isn't theirs, the right response isn't panic or anger, it's clarity. Karen made her choice when she turned that key and stepped inside. I made mine when I shut the door and picked up the phone. And in the end, the outcome was exactly what it should have been.